A starving nurse healed a wealthy cowboy in snow until he made her his world. The snow was falling harder than anyone could have expected. Thick, heavy flakes blanketed the mountains, covering the winding roads in a pure white silence. The wind howled through the trees, making them sway and groan. It was the kind of winter storm that made even the strongest people hesitate. But for Elena, a young nurse, hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. She gripped her coat tightly around her thin frame, forcing herself to keep moving. Her stomach ached from hunger, her legs were sore, and her fingers were numb, but she had a job to do. Someone needed her help, and she would not turn back, not even for the storm. Elena had been traveling for hours in her small, battered car, which struggled through the thick snow. Every mile she drove seemed harder than the last, the tires slipping and spinning, fighting the icy road. She had packed only a small bag of essentials, medical supplies, a few scraps of food, and a blanket. But the cold made even these meager comforts almost useless. Her mind kept drifting to the stories she had heard about people trapped in storms like this. Some of them never making it through the night. She shook her head. She couldn't let herself think like that. There was someone out there who needed her now. Far across the mountains, at a large ranch that stretched as far as the eye could see, Jake Carson was struggling to stay conscious. A skilled cowboy, strong and capable, he was used to facing challenges head-on. But the accident had been sudden and severe. A horse, startled by the wind, had thrown him to the ground. He had landed awkwardly, injuring his shoulder and hitting his head. Alone in the snow-covered fields, he had tried to drag himself back to the ranch house, but each movement sent sharp pain through his body. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps, and the cold gnawed at him like a predator. He knew he couldn't last long like this. By some small miracle, Elena reached the ranch just as Jake's vision began to blur. She stepped out of her car, her boots sinking into the fresh snow, and felt the wind cut through her like icy knives. She squinted against the storm, scanning the landscape for signs of life. Her heart skipped a beat when she spotted him lying in the snow, barely moving. Fear gripped her for only a moment before determination took over. She ran toward him, ignoring her own exhaustion, ignoring the biting wind, focusing only on the man who needed her help. "Hang on!" she called out, her voice almost lost in the storm. She dropped her bag and knelt beside him, immediately assessing his condition. His face was pale, lips tinged blue from the cold, and his eyes fluttered weakly. She felt a rush of urgency. He was hypothermic, and every second counted. Carefully, she pulled her blanket from her bag and wrapped him as best she could. She checked his pulse, relieved to find it still strong, though fast and weak. Then she carefully examined his shoulder and head. There was swelling and bruising, and she could feel the tension in his muscles. He had been in serious pain. "Elena!" Jake croaked, barely lifting his head. His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. You came?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her own trembling. "I'm here! You're going to be okay! I won't let anything happen to you." Jake's lips curved slightly, a faint expression of relief. He tried to shift, but pain shot through his shoulder. Elena quickly adjusted him, making sure he was comfortable while still keeping him wrapped against the cold. She tore strips of fabric from her coat to stabilize his arm and minimize movement. Every action felt urgent. One mistake, one delay, and the snowstorm might claim him before she could help. Elena's own body ached, her muscles screaming in protest, but she forced herself to ignore it. Hunger clawed at her stomach, but she pushed it aside. Right now, survival meant helping him. She tore open a small pack of food, hard biscuits and a few chocolate bars, and tried to coax him into eating. At first he shook his head, too weak and stubborn to eat. But she insisted gently, offering small bites until he finally managed to swallow. The chocolate helped give him a small surge of energy, enough for him to keep his eyes open. Hours passed, the storm showing no signs of slowing. Snow piled up around the cabin, and the wind rattled the doors and windows. Inside, Elena worked tirelessly, tending to his injuries and keeping him warm. She spoke softly to him, telling stories about her life, her struggles and small details meant to distract him from the pain. Jake listened, sometimes responding with a faint smile or a whisper, the beginnings of trust forming between them. It was in these quiet moments amidst the chaos outside that something shifted. The fear and pain in Jake's eyes slowly gave way to gratitude, and even more than that, a fragile, growing sense of connection. He had always been independent, used to handling everything on his own. But here, in the middle of a storm with a young nurse kneeling beside him, he realized he could rely on someone else. And Elena, despite her own exhaustion, found herself caring not just for a patient, but for a man she had only just met and yet already felt responsible for in a way she had never experienced before. By the time night fell, the storm had reached its peak. Outside, the snowstorm created a world of white, trapping them in isolation. Inside, Elena had managed to build a small fire, the warmth beginning to seep into the cabin. She checked Jake again, making sure his pulse was steady, his breathing regular. His eyes followed her every movement, and though he was too weak to speak much, the look in his eyes said everything. He trusted her. Elena finally allowed herself a brief moment of rest, leaning back against the wall, her fingers numb and aching. She could barely eat herself, but she tried, forcing down small bites of the chocolate and biscuit she had brought. Her body was tired, her stomach growling, but she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had found him in the snow. She had kept him alive. And for now, that was enough. The night was long. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the snow piled higher, pressing against the windows as if trying to get inside. But inside that little cabin, a fragile bubble of warmth and safety existed. Elena kept vigil, her eyes never leaving him, her hands never idle. She cleaned his wounds, adjusted his blankets, and spoke in a calm, steady voice whenever he stirred. Every time she felt him weaken, a surge of determination pushed her to act faster, do more, and give more of herself. When morning came, the storm had softened slightly. The snow still fell, but the wind had lessened, and a faint light peeked through the clouds. Jake's condition had improved, thanks entirely to Elena's tireless care. He was still weak, still pale, but he was alive. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition that this was only the beginning. Elena knew she had made a difference, not just in his survival but in his life. And though she herself was exhausted, still hungry and sore, she felt a spark of pride and hope. She had faced the storm, faced the snow, and faced fear itself. And she had prevailed. Jake, lying there, looked at her with eyes that reflected more than gratitude. There was something else there, a quiet admiration, a growing respect, and perhaps even the first hints of trust that could turn into something deeper. He had been alone, vulnerable, and now he was beginning to realize that someone cared for him, truly cared for him, without expecting anything in return. As they both settled into an uneasy sleep, exhausted but alive, the snowstorm outside raged on. But inside, amidst the blankets, the warmth, and the quiet determination of a young nurse, a fragile bond had formed. A bond born out of survival, care, and shared struggle. And neither of them knew yet how deeply it would change their lives. The morning after, the storm brought a pale, quiet light through the small windows of the cabin. Snow still blanketed the mountains, and the world outside seemed frozen, peaceful yet harsh. Inside, Elena stirred quietly, careful not to wake Jake. Her body ached from the long night of caring for him, but a quiet satisfaction warmed her heart. She had kept him alive. She had done what many might have thought impossible. Jake was awake now, though weak, sitting up slightly with Elena's support. His shoulder was still tender, and his muscles ached, but his eyes held a spark of life. He tried to stand, but his legs wobbled. Elena immediately steadied him, wrapping her arm around his waist. "Take it slow," she said gently. "One step at a time." Jake nodded, his lips forming a small, grateful smile. I can't believe you stayed with me all night," he said softly. "You didn't have to. I couldn't leave you," Elena replied simply, her voice steady. "You needed help. And I know what it's like to be in trouble, alone." Her words seemed to surprise him. He had always been strong, used to relying on himself, solving problems on his own. But now, he realized that someone had truly cared for him, risking their own safety to make sure he lived. It was a new feeling for him, and it left him silent for a moment, just staring at her with a mixture of gratitude and awe. The day stretched ahead, and though the storm had lessened, the world outside was still dangerous. Roads were blocked, supplies were scarce, and the cold made even simple tasks difficult. Elena moved with care, checking Jake's wounds again, cleaning them carefully and ensuring that the makeshift bandages were secure. She gave him water to drink, small bites of food to regain strength, and instructions to rest whenever his body demanded it. As the hours passed, their conversation began to deepen. At first it was small talk, questions about the weather, the ranch, and her journey, but gradually they opened up about their lives. Elena spoke of her struggles as a nurse. She shared how hard it was to make a living, how exhausting it could be to care for people day after day while barely keeping herself fed. She told him about nights when she had gone hungry so that her patients could eat, about the worry she carried for the people she treated, and about her dream to make a difference in the world, even in small ways. Jake listened quietly, fascinated by her strength and dedication. He had always thought his life was hard, managing a large ranch, dealing with business pressures, ensuring the safety of his workers. But hearing her story gave him perspective. He realized how selfless she was, how much she sacrificed for others without asking for anything in return. In turn, Jake shared parts of his life. He spoke of the ranch, the responsibilities that weighed on him, and the loneliness that often came with it. He talked about growing up with wealth and expectations, about how people judged him for the life he had, and how sometimes it felt like no one saw the real him. Elena listened intently, asking gentle questions, offering quiet understanding rather than judgment. The storm outside was relentless, but inside a fragile warmth grew between them. They laughed together over small things, a clumsy attempt to balance food on the table, a snowflake that landed on Jake's nose, and slowly their trust deepened. Each shared story, each quiet laugh was a brick in the foundation of a connection that neither had expected but both felt. Despite the growing bond, challenges remained. Jake's shoulder still pained him, and moving was difficult. He was frustrated by his own weakness, used to being independent and strong. At times, he tried to push himself too far, testing his limits, and Elena had to stop him, sometimes with a firm hand, sometimes with a gentle word. Each time, he learned a little more about letting someone care for him, about accepting help without feeling weak. Elena, too, faced her own challenges. Her energy was low, and her body constantly reminded her of hunger and fatigue. But she refused to let it stop her. Every time she felt herself faltering, she reminded herself of why she had come. She looked at Jake, alive because of her care, and found strength she didn't know she had. Her exhaustion became secondary to the mission she had set for herself, to make sure he recovered. By evening, the snow had eased slightly, though the world remained coated in white. The two shared a quiet meal, simple and humble, bread, cheese, and a little leftover chocolate. But it was enough. Sitting across from each other, sharing food, warmth, and conversation, they began to see each other as more than just nurse and patient. They were two people, each shaped by struggle, each learning to rely on the other in ways they had never imagined. Small gestures began to carry deeper meaning. Jake would reach for Elena's hand when he needed support, and she would gently adjust his blankets or help him to sit comfortably. Their eyes met often, and in those moments, words were not needed. There was a silent understanding, a recognition that they were forming a bond stronger than simple gratitude. The night brought a new set of challenges. The wind rose again, rattling the windows and doors, and the temperature dropped. Jake shivered despite the blankets, and Elena had to hold him close, sharing warmth as she had done the night before. They spoke softly to each other, finding comfort in quiet words and shared presence. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by pain, discomfort, or worry about the storm outside. During one long, quiet moment, Jake spoke softly. I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You didn't have to do this. You could have left." Elena shook her head gently. "I couldn't. Someone needed help, and you were the one who needed it most. I couldn't just leave you here to the storm."
He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw the full weight of what she had done.
A young woman, exhausted and hungry, had risked herself to save a man she barely knew. And she had done it without hesitation. He felt a mix of admiration, gratitude, and something new, something he couldn't quite name. The next morning, the storm had calmed further, leaving the world outside bright and sparkling with fresh snow. Jake could stand more easily now, though still with careful support. They stepped outside together briefly, just to see the vast, quiet landscape. The mountains were breathtaking, stark against the white snow, and the ranch looked both peaceful and daunting. Elena helped him move carefully, holding him steady as he tested his strength. He laughed quietly, a sound full of relief and warmth. "I don't think I could have survived this without you," he admitted. "You don't have to think," Elena said with a smile. "You were never alone, and I'll keep helping as long as you need me." That day, they worked together on small tasks, clearing snow from the cabin steps, checking on the horses in their pens, and making sure the fire was steady and safe. It was hard work, but it allowed them to share moments of normalcy amidst the isolation. Each task, each shared responsibility brought them closer. They began to rely on each other naturally, without effort, in a way that was both comforting and profound. By evening, Jake was strong enough to move around more freely. He found himself watching Elena with admiration. She was tireless, kind, and strong in ways he had never seen. And slowly, without either of them realizing, his feelings began to deepen. He was no longer just grateful. He was drawn to her courage, her heart, and the way she had stayed with him when no one else would. Elena, too, felt the change. She had come to the ranch expecting a difficult journey, a patient to care for, and perhaps a story to tell. But what she found was far more than that. She felt respect for him. Yes, but also a quiet fascination and warmth she hadn't expected. In the midst of hardship and snow, they had found a connection neither had anticipated. A bond that was beginning to feel like something unbreakable. That night, as the wind howled faintly outside and the cabin was quiet, they sat together by the fire. Jake's shoulder was healing slowly, and Elena's hands were steady and gentle as she checked his bandages one last time for the night. Words were few, but the silence spoke volumes. Trust, care, and a budding affection filled the room more fully than the crackling fire ever could. For the first time since the storm began, both felt a small sense of peace. They had survived the worst together. They had shared fears, stories, laughter, and quiet moments of understanding. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, both in terms of recovery and the challenges outside the cabin, they knew that they would not face it alone. The days following the storm brought both relief and new challenges. The snow had slowed to a soft, steady fall, but the mountains were still covered in thick white, and the cold seeped into every corner of the ranch. Jake was stronger now, able to move without Elena's constant support, but his body was still tender. Every step was a reminder of the accident, every movement a test of patience. Elena stayed close, offering guidance, care, and quiet encouragement. The cabin had become their small world. Outside, the ranch sprawled endlessly, white and silent, but inside, they had routines. Meals were simple: bread, cheese, small portions of meat, and each one became a ritual. They shared food and laughter, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes softly, but always together. Jake had learned to accept help without embarrassment, and Elena had found joy in nurturing someone who was proud, yet gentle. One morning, Jake tried to saddle one of the horses. His shoulder protested, muscles straining, and he winced. Elena stepped forward. "Careful," she said. "Let me help." He shook his head stubbornly, a small smile playing at his lips. "I've handled horses all my life. I can do this." "I know you can," she said softly. "But you don't have to do it alone." Her words lingered, and for a moment he just looked at her. Then he sighed and let her guide him. Together they worked quietly, sharing small jokes about his stubbornness and her patience. It was in these everyday moments that their bond deepened, through cooperation, understanding, and small acts of care that neither had expected to mean so much. As the days passed, their conversations grew more personal. Jake began to speak about his family, the expectations placed on him, and the pressure of keeping the ranch running. He admitted he often felt isolated despite the wealth and status that surrounded him. Elena listened with empathy, asking questions and offering gentle observations. "You carry a lot on your shoulders," she said one evening, sitting beside him by the fire. "Sometimes it's okay to let someone else help." "You don't have to be strong all the time." Jake looked at her, studying her face in the warm glow of the firelight. There was something in her tone, gentle, patient, and understanding, that made him feel safe in a way he had never known. He wanted to tell her everything, to share the parts of himself he usually kept hidden, but words were hard to find. Instead, he reached for her hand, a small gesture that spoke louder than anything he could say. Elena's fingers brushed against his, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She squeezed his hand lightly, giving him a smile that was soft but full of reassurance. In that simple touch, they both felt a connection that went beyond words, something built on trust, care, and mutual respect. The snow outside continued to fall, covering the landscape in a thick, silent blanket. The world was still harsh, the mountains unforgiving, but inside the cabin, a small warmth existed that neither of them had anticipated. They spent hours together, talking, laughing, and sometimes just sitting in quiet companionship. Each day brought them closer, their shared experiences forming a bond that was growing stronger with every passing moment. One afternoon, Jake decided to try walking to the barn to check on the horses. Elena insisted on accompanying him, carrying a small bag of supplies in case anything went wrong. The snow was deep and the wind cut through their coats, but they moved slowly, supporting each other. Jake occasionally stumbled, and Elena caught him, steadying him with a gentle hand. "You've really gotten stronger," she said, smiling as she helped him regain his balance. "I had a good teacher," he replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "I couldn't have done it without you." Her cheeks flushed at his words, and she looked away, focusing on the path ahead. But inside, she felt a warmth she couldn't ignore. He was no longer just a patient. He was someone she cared about deeply, someone whose safety and happiness mattered to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The days turned into a week, and their routines became natural. Jake was able to perform light tasks around the ranch, always with Elena nearby. They shared meals, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection. The cabin, once just a place of survival, had become a sanctuary, a place where trust and affection could grow. One evening, after checking the horses, they returned to the cabin to find the fire almost gone. The cold crept into their bones, and Jake shivered despite the blankets. Elena moved close, wrapping her arms around him to share warmth. He leaned into her, grateful for her presence, and for the first time he allowed himself to relax completely. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "You don't have to know," she replied softly. "I'm here now, and that's what matters." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. They sat together in silence, feeling the fire's warmth in the presence of the other, knowing that their connection had grown into something neither had expected but both welcomed. As the night deepened, the storm outside had fully passed, leaving the world quiet and still. The mountains glistened under the pale moonlight, and the snow sparkled like diamonds. Inside the cabin, Jake and Elena sat together, close enough to feel each other's warmth, yet still hesitant in the face of their growing feelings. Jake reached for Elena's hand again, this time holding it more firmly. "Elena," he said softly, I don't want to lose you." Her heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, seeing the sincerity and vulnerability in his eyes. "You won't," she said, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "I'm not going anywhere." It was a small promise, but it meant more than either of them could fully express. In that moment, the walls between them began to crumble, replaced by trust, care, and the beginnings of love. They didn't need to speak more. The connection was clear in their hands, their glances, and the quiet understanding that had grown between them. The following days were filled with work and recovery. Jake regained more strength each day, and Elena's confidence in her ability to help him grew as well. They faced small challenges together, clearing snow from the barn, ensuring the fire stayed lit, checking on the horses, but each challenge only brought them closer. They learned to rely on each other in ways they hadn't expected, forming a partnership that was as practical as it was emotional. One morning, after a particularly long night of tending to the horses during a light snowfall, Jake surprised Elena by bringing her a cup of hot tea. She had been exhausted, her hands cold and her body sore, and the simple gesture warmed her heart more than words could describe. "Here," he said, handing her the cup. "For all the mornings you've helped me, this is for you." She smiled, taking the cup with both hands. "Thank you," she said softly. "But we've helped each other. Don't forget that." He nodded, understanding the truth in her words. Their relationship had grown beyond simple gratitude. It had become a partnership, a connection built on shared struggle, mutual respect, and quiet affection. As the days passed, the winter slowly began to give way to early signs of spring. The snow softened, the mountains glistened in the sunlight, and the world seemed to awaken. Yet, inside the cabin, their bond remained constant, unshaken by time or circumstance. They had faced hardship together, and through it they had discovered something profound, a connection that neither had anticipated but both cherished deeply. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, casting golden light across the snow, Jake and Elena sat together by the fire. He reached for her hand again, this time holding it without hesitation. "Elena," he said, his voice steady and full of feeling, "I don't know how to say this, but you mean more to me than I ever thought possible." Her heart raced, but she met his gaze, seeing the truth in his eyes. I feel the same," she admitted softly. "I never expected this, but I can't deny it. In that moment, the world outside, the snow, the mountains, the hardships they had faced mattered little. What mattered was the bond they had formed, the trust they had built, and the feelings that had grown quietly between them. They had survived the storm together, and in doing so had discovered something far more powerful, the beginning of love, built on care, respect, and shared struggle. The night grew darker, but neither felt fear or loneliness. They had found strength in each other, and that strength was enough to face whatever challenges the mountains or the world might throw at them. And as they sat together, hands entwined, hearts beating in quiet harmony, they both knew that this was only the beginning of a journey they would face together, side by side. The snow had finally begun to melt, leaving the mountains glistening in the early spring sunlight. The ranch looked transformed, softer, and almost peaceful. Yet there was a sense of life returning to the world. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, and the faint sound of running water came from melted snow flowing into the streams. The harsh winter was behind them, but its lessons remained alive in both Jake and Elena. Jake stood at the edge of the cabin porch looking out over his land. The experience of the past weeks had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He had always thought of himself as strong and independent, capable of handling anything, yet the storm and the accident had shown him a truth he could not ignore. Even the strongest man sometimes needs help, and there is strength in accepting care, in trusting someone else. Elena joined him quietly, carrying a small basket with food she had prepared for their breakfast. She smiled as she looked out over the ranch, her eyes reflecting both pride and affection. She had been through so much: hunger, exhaustion, fear. But in those challenges, she had discovered a new sense of strength within herself. She had helped save a life, but more than that, she had helped build a connection that would change both of them forever. "Morning," Jake said softly, his voice still husky from sleep but full of warmth. "Morning," Elena replied, setting the basket down on the porch railing. She glanced at him, noticing the faint lines of worry still around his eyes, now softened by a small smile. They shared breakfast in comfortable silence, each bite a reminder of their progress. The snow outside glistened, and the air smelled of fresh water and cold earth. It was a world renewed, much like they themselves were renewed, each strengthened by the challenges they had faced together. Once breakfast was finished, Jake took a deep breath. "Elena," he began, his voice serious but gentle. I need to tell you something. Elena turned to him, sensing the weight of his words. What is it? She asked softly. I don't want you to leave, he said, looking directly into her eyes. I can't imagine going back to life without you here. Not just here at the ranch, but in my life. You've changed everything for me. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. She had suspected this might be coming, had hoped for it even, but hearing it aloud made it real. Jake, she started, her voice trembling slightly. She swallowed hard, searching for words. I feel the same. I never expected to feel this way, but I can't deny it anymore. He reached for her hand, holding it firmly, and she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the sun or the cabin's fire. It was the warmth of trust, of care, of a bond that had grown stronger through every hardship they had faced together. I want you to stay, he said softly. Not because I need help, not because I want someone to care for me, but because I want you in my life. You've become my world. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. I want to stay, she whispered. I want to be here, with you. In that moment, words were no longer necessary. Their hands intertwined, fingers laced tightly, hearts beating in quiet harmony. The world outside, the mountains, the melting snow, the sunlight, faded into the background. What mattered was here, now, in this bond they had built through survival, care, and quiet love. The days that followed were full of shared work and quiet joy. Together they tended to the ranch, cared for the horses, and prepared the land for the new season. Each task was a chance to learn more about each other, to laugh, to tease, and to enjoy the comfort of partnership. Jake discovered the joy of having someone to share his life with, someone who cared for him not because of his wealth or his status, but because of who he truly was. Elena, too, found a new sense of belonging. She had come to the ranch as a nurse, a stranger facing a dangerous storm, but she had stayed to heal, to care, and ultimately to love. In Jake, she found someone who respected her strength, who valued her courage, and who offered a place in his world without expectation or demand. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the sky turned gold and pink, Jake and Elena stood together at the edge of the porch, watching the changing light. The air was crisp, the snow soft beneath their boots, and the world seemed to hold its breath.
Elena, Jake said quietly, his hand brushing hers. These past weeks, I've never known life like this.
I've never felt like I belong anywhere, but now, with you,
I feel like I've finally found home. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled through them.
I feel the same, she said. I never imagined I could find someone like you. Someone who understands me, who trusts me, who cares for me. I've never felt safer, stronger, or happier. They stood in silence for a moment, letting the words sink in, letting the quiet mountain evening wrap around them like a protective blanket. Then, without thinking, Jake leaned in and kissed her softly. It was gentle, full of emotion, and carried the weight of everything they had been through together. Elena responded, her heart swelling with happiness and love she had only begun to understand. As the weeks passed, their bond only deepened. Spring continued to arrive in the mountains, melting the snow, awakening the land, and bringing new life. Flowers began to peek through the thawing earth, and the ranch slowly returned to its full activity. Jake and Elena worked side by side, but now, their connection added something deeper, a sense of purpose, warmth, and shared joy that went beyond any task. They laughed together, celebrated small successes, and found comfort in quiet moments of shared presence. Each day they discovered something new about each other. Small quirks, gentle habits, and ways of seeing the world that made them stronger as a team. They learned to communicate without words, to trust without hesitation, and to care for one another without expectation. One afternoon, as they prepared the barn for the new season, Jake paused and looked at Elena. "You've changed everything for me," he said softly. "Not just by saving my life, but by showing me that there's more to living than just surviving. With you, I've learned what it means to truly care, to trust, and to love." Elena felt her chest tighten with emotion. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "And you've shown me that love can be gentle, strong, and patient," she said. "That it's not just about helping, but about being there, fully, for someone else. You've given me so much more than I ever expected." The bond they had built over the weeks of survival had blossomed into something permanent. It was no longer about the storm, the snow, or even the injuries. It was about life, love, and partnership. They had faced hardship together and emerged stronger, connected in a way that could not be broken by distance, fear, or circumstance. As the sun set one evening, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, Jake and Elena stood together, watching the world awaken from winter. Jake pulled Elena close, holding her in his arms, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I want to build a life with you," he said quietly, his voice full of certainty. "A life where we face everything together, where we laugh, work, and love side by side." "You're my world, Elena. I don't want anything else but you." Elena lifted her head, her eyes shining. "I want that too," she said. "I want to face everything with you. To build a life together, to love and be loved. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." They embraced, feeling the strength of their bond, the warmth of their hearts, and the promise of a future built on trust, care, and love. The mountains stood around them, silent witnesses to a connection forged in hardship and nurtured in the quiet moments of understanding. The next days were filled with preparation for the future. Jake introduced Elena to the ranch's daily routines. Not as a visitor, but as a partner. She learned more about horses, about caring for the land, and about managing the ranch's work. Jake, in turn, learned to rely on her wisdom, her courage, and her unwavering support. Together, they made decisions, solved problems, and built a rhythm that reflected not just efficiency but love and respect. Evenings became their time. They cooked together, shared stories from their past, and dreamed about the future. Each night they held each other close, feeling gratitude for the bond they had built and for the challenges that had brought them together. They were no longer just survivor and nurse, patient and caretaker. They were partners, equals, and now, lovers bound by a shared history and a shared heart. One quiet evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and stars began to sparkle in the clear sky, Jake turned to Elena. "I don't ever want to imagine life without you," he said softly. "You've changed me, made me stronger, better, and happier than I ever thought possible. I want you to be part of every moment, every day." Elena smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "And I want the same," she said. "I never imagined I could feel this way, but I can't deny it. You're my home, Jake, my safe place, my future." They kissed under the stars, a quiet promise that their journey together was only beginning. The hardships of winter had taught them resilience, the storm had forged trust, and the snow had given them time to see each other's hearts. Now, as spring returned to the mountains, they could face the world together, confident that whatever came next, they would not face it alone. Life on the ranch continued, filled with work, laughter, and love. Each day was a reminder of how far they had come, from a storm, an accident, and survival, to building a life full of hope, trust, and shared dreams. They had found in each other not only safety and care, but a love that was steadfast, patient, and true. And so, in the quiet mountains, surrounded by melting snow and the promise of new life, Jake and Elena began their life together. Two hearts forged in adversity, now beating as one, ready to face everything the world might bring, side by side forever.